Welcome to Miniature Steam Hacks, Hints and Tips. This compilation video series is a very useful reference, and this is actually part 59. I've changed this series from being public to make it only viewable by my Patreon supporters. This is because a YouTube viewer, who has a YouTube channel with 3 very small videos on there, said that he'd seen all these videos before and it was against YouTube rules. So from now on, this compilation series will only be available for my kind Patreon supporters. This episode poses a question that I get asked very frequently. I have this old engine, is it worth renovating? It's a matter of opinion really. In the case of this 1903 clockwork tinplate locomotive made by Bing of Nuremberg in Germany, it definitely is worth restoring. In the second part of this episode, you will see me working on a very decrepit Bassett-Loke twin-cylinder steam engine. I don't have a chimney for this locomotive at all, and the top of the smoke box is a bit distorted, so once again, using my new Proxon rotary tool with the flexible drive attachment, I'm cleaning up the top surface of the smoke box to accept the new chimney that I'm going to make. So now it's over to the lathe. I'm carving the shape of a chimney out of this piece of brass. When I was a child, I used to obsessively play with a toy called an Etch-a-Sketch. You turn 2 knobs and you can draw pictures on a screen. And the experience gained by trying to draw diagonal lines on an Etch-a-Sketch by turning both of the knobs exactly the same amount at exactly the same time has been very useful, because that's what I'm doing at the moment, and in no time at all the chimney starts to take shape. According to my calculations from looking at the photograph and comparing the chimney to the dome and measuring the dome on the model that I have, is that the chimney is a total of 1 3/4 of an inch high. Sometimes I forget that I'm on the Boxford lathe and try and take too deep a cut. You should always take the depth of cut that the lathe will cope with. And don't forget, this is quite a large, broad, round nose tool, not a single point cutter. Next, I need to drill a hole down the middle of the chimney, because it wouldn't be a chimney without one of those. But I do not want the drill bit to go all the way through. At the bottom of the chimney it needs to be a much smaller hole so that I can bolt the chimney to the smoke box. The second drill's going in now, and it's much bigger than the first one. Once again, I've also marked it with a felt tip pen, and this twist drill is 5/8 of an inch in diameter, and this looks to be about the right size for the hole in the chimney. In this clip I'm using some very coarse sandpaper to remove the sharp edge around the hole that I've just drilled, and here I'm using the sandpaper on the outside of the piece just to remove some of the tool marks. And finally I use some wet to dry sandpaper, and this is to remove the marks left by the coarse grit paper. So here's the finished chimney in position on the locomotive, and I think it looks about right. So how did I cut the part to make this chimney fit on top of the smoke box? Did I set up a fly cutter or a big milling cutter? No. I did it entirely on my belt sander like this. And as I got very close to the radius that I needed, I just kept trying it for size on the smoke box. Obviously the part got very hot while I was doing this, but just off camera below it is a pot of water. This freshly machined chimney cap isn't going to look good against the rest of the parts of the engine, because it's very sort of squeaky clean and newly polished on the polishing spindle. So I'm going to oxidise it slightly, and I'm going to put years of oxidisation on in seconds using a blowtorch. In this clip you can see how the chimney looks on the locomotive, and I think I've got it somewhere near. By profiling the base of the chimney using the belt sander or linisher, I could make some fine adjustments so it fitted the smoke box very well, because the smoke box is not 100% round. With the magic of video and superimposition, here I've superimposed the original photograph on top of the engine, and I think it looks somewhere near. This very old steam plant with very dodgy soldering was given to me by Simon at steamworkshop.co.uk. It's not something that's saleable in this condition, and it's really not worth the trouble of dismantling it, repairing it, putting it all back together for what the overall steam plant would be worth. So Simon gave it to me, and I thought, well, I'll have a look at it one day, but then I kept looking at it in a corner of my workshop with its science fiction soldering. It looks like something out of a science fiction horror film. So I thought, well, I'll just remove that solder because it's really bothering me. I used this very small blowtorch, which was worse than useless. In the end I took it into the outer part of the workshop and used my proper blowtorch to melt the solder, brush it away so I could free off the connections to underneath the baseboard. All the components of this steam plant are crudely mounted on a piece of aluminium which is screwed onto a piece of wood, so I'll be putting that in the bin. But before I applied some common sense and took the whole plant into the outer part of the workshop, I thought I would just cremate a paintbrush. At least this mini blowtorch got rid of some of the solder, but it would have taken far too long to do it this way. The pipe from the boiler was also soldered to the engine pipe, and I could see that it was a nut that was between the two pipes, so I assumed that if I warmed up the solder with this mini blowtorch, I'd be able to undo the nut. And indeed, once the solder was melted, the nut did move. So I started undoing the nut, and then I realised that this nut was damaged. That's why it had been soldered, because the entire side of the nut was cracked. You can see this clearly in the clip that's currently on screen. Trying to undo the nut very carefully was a complete waste of time, so I just used a large pair of pliers and very quickly unscrewed the nut from the engine's piping. So eventually the engine was separated from the baseboard, and here it is on the bench. The first thing to do, flood it with oil. It's anybody's guess how long it was since this engine last ran, so treating the engine to a copious amount of machine oil is a good idea at this stage. I'm trying not to miss anything out, and the oil's going everywhere, which is not a problem because eventually this engine will either go in the bin or it will go into a bath of cellulose thinners, which is known as lacquer thinner in the USA. And the reason that the engine is going to go into a bath of lacquer thinner, or cellulose thinners as it's known in the UK, is to remove all the paint. It looks like it's been painted with a tar brush, but first of all I need to make sure the engine works, because if it's beyond economical repair, it's really not worth working on. The engine's timing is nowhere near where it should be, so I'm putting this right. And just for the record, the larger lobe of the eccentric should always be at the 90-degree position relative to the crank pin. And on a twin-cylinder steam engine like this one, the eccentric on the other side should also be at 90 degrees to the crank pin, but don't forget that needs to be 90 degrees in the opposite direction to the other crank pin. Oddly enough, on this side I couldn't find the eccentric adjustment. I wasn't thinking. I removed the eccentric strap to realise there was no eccentric. The eccentric is part of the flywheel. Now, that's a new one on me. How clever is that? So whilst being a little bit embarrassed by being stupid, and I should have known better, I refitted the eccentric strap, then slackened off the grub screw in the flywheel, which allowed me to rotate the flywheel and subsequently the eccentric to the correct position to make the engine work, hopefully. Whenever you set the timing on a model steam engine, you should always start off by making sure that the larger lobe of the eccentric is at 90 degrees to the crank pin. Then, once the engine runs, or doesn't run as the case may be, you can make minor adjustments to make it run sweetly. Some viewers may be saying, but how do you know when it's 90 degrees? You don't have a jigging position. But forget all that, I'm a musician, not an engineer. I just know how to make steam engines work. So now it's time to connect up the airline. With the correct settings, the engine runs very well indeed. I'm quite surprised at this myself. And what is more surprising is there is not a trace of a leak on the piston valve assemblies. With an old engine like this, it's a good idea to initially flood it with oil, run it for a short time, and then flood it with oil again, which will wash out any dirt particles from the mechanics. This is a piston valve engine, and piston valves wear out, whereas slide valves wear in, so to speak. And the piston valves on this engine are not worn at all. Quite amazing. This is the top plug of the displacement lubricator, and there's nothing much left of the washer. It really is a very old engine after all. I turned it upside down and drained some water out and some very old looking oil. In place of the fibre washer that crumbled to nothing, I've fitted an O-ring temporarily. Yes, I'm quite amazed. You can clearly see here that there's nothing leaking from the piston valves. The only leak I can see is on the cylinder nearest to the camera, where the crosshead guide fits to the cylinder itself. I'll look into this in greater detail later. When I look closely at the engine, I can see that this engine used to be painted green, but I won't start talking about painting it just yet. Time for me to stop talking and just let you listen and watch the engine running. I've learnt that certain things that are old and dirty and unloved and don't work properly are not always a bad thing. And thinking about it, I used to have a girlfriend like that. On that note, I'd just like to say thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.